Okay. The ambiguities of life are hard. And very few of us really want to go there. And very few of us want to live there. And so it's easier on our emotional, physical, spiritual well-being to kind of slide over on one side or the other. And so you're absolutely right. We are there. I mean, we have embraced. So it's also somewhat difficult for us to see the ambiguity and want to live there. Does that make sense? And I think that's probably one of the things that may separate countryside from other places. We are at least willing to look at it. At least willing to examine and ask the critical question. And in asking that critical question, realize, we do live in the ambiguity of the same. So let's move forward. That's always leave that one on the table, and we can talk about that from time to time. We're going to start today with what is virtually described as, understood as, the theme for Paul through much of the letter. Because one of the things that emerges out of this that we're going to see come to us time and time again is Paul's struggling with this whole idea of faith being the foundation for who we are and our relationship with God. So it begins, I think, by revealing something about the community that he is writing to. I am not ashamed of the gospel. Okay. If he's not ashamed of the gospel, then where is the shame coming from? What is this shame that he is referring to? And I suspect that it has to do with the story itself among Gentiles. Here is a impoverished Palestinian Jew who has been teaching and healing and is crucified and is risen. And that story is not so unforeign to them in that, that is told about their emperors, Caesars. And so you can see that here, the story that they kind of expect comes from power. Just like we talk about the birth story. We would expect it to be born in power. We expect the crucifixion to be born or to occur in that realm of power and influence. But it isn't. It is consistent with the message of vulnerability and weakness and strength found in servanthood and weakness. Just to take a side trip, I really like that. I was forwarded a story today that I think really illustrates this. It is about an 11-year-old boy who had lost his left arm. And he began, though, to study judo. And the sensei, or the teacher, taught him one move. And, after a couple of months, he would ask, well, what more do I need? And he would say, you have what you need. And he kept asking, well, he got into his first tournament, and eventually whoever it was got over frustrated and he won. Well, I can make this story long, but it ends up that he wins a championship. And on the way after that, he asked his teacher about the move. And he said, well, you learned the most difficult move there is in judo. And you have learned to execute that. And the only defense for that move is to grab your left arm. His weakness had become his power. I don't think that there is a better model anywhere than that says about the teaching that Jesus has for us. And as I reflected back to this email, I thought, I very seldom think about my weaknesses. I'm trying to examine my strengths, and I said at first, I think that's a male thing, and then I thought, no, I've seen a lot of women who rely on their macho side too, and their macho instincts. So it's not a male thing, it's a we thing. But maybe we really need to spend some time thinking, hello there, thinking about our weaknesses as our strength. Okay, back on track. Not ashamed of the gospel. So, this gospel message has a lot of ramifications to it that even today we find ourselves somewhat ashamed of. Nonviolent, turning the other cheek, giving your coat. I mean, who does that in our world today as we try to understand what that means? So, even today, we're not so far away from having some shame on what we embrace as the gospel. Forgiving our enemies, forgiving those, well, you get the message. So when Paul talks about, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, there is something behind that in which there was going on in the community shame. And probably something that was going on that may have motivated some of them to leave the community. Not able to embrace the power of this good news. And so he says, I'm not ashamed of it. Not only is he not ashamed of it, I stand on it. My life was discovered within it. And he says, and he has experienced, I don't think these are words, philosophical determination. These are words out of his heart. It is the power of God for salvation. And we can take a look at that word salvation a lot, because I think, unfortunately, we have tied salvation into a ticket to heaven. That what it means is that all of those limitations that I have done over my lifetime need to be cleared up so I can get the ticket punched to heaven. And I don't know where I'm going today. Another story. Einstein gets on board the train. I mean, this is supposedly a literal train. He gets on board a train and he sits down, and the conductor is coming through to punch his ticket to heaven. And so he starts going through his pockets, his coat, and he can't find his ticket. Well, the conductor comes up to him and he says, "You've been on this train a lot of times. I recognize who you are. I know you have a ticket. You will find it. I'll go on and come back." Well, when he comes back, he still hasn't found the ticket. And the conductor says, "Not an issue." And Einstein says, "Yes, it is. I don't know where I'm going." So, having our ticket punched does have some important relevance in that journey. But I think that unfortunately, we have isolated salvation to mean going to punch this ticket to heaven, rather than taking a look that it is God acting in the oppressive forces of our life to give us life. The whole Passover week is celebrating God acting in the life of God's people to free them from an oppressive power. If we take seriously this crucifixion, we have to take a look at that Jesus was killed by the Roman authorities. It's the only way it could have happened. They're the only ones that had the authority to do it. And they did it in collusion with those in the temple. But not all the Jews were responsible. Anyway, we need to take a look at that with what Paul then understands and is expressing as salvation and what the people might hear. At this particular point, they are not hearing anything about a ticket to heaven. They are hearing that God operates there in their life in the midst of the darkness and the oppression and the power of the gospel. You have to forgive me. I'm on the board of preaching, and I gotta be certain I'm kind of staying away from that. But the power of the gospel for people who are oppressed, who are rejected, who are on the peripheral end of society, whose very lives are threatened every day, and they hear this message that God is there to support you in your journey. And it's demonstrated by Jesus with regards to who did he heal? Who did he teach? Who did he love? Who did he? So the gospel has power to everyone, and this who has faith. And again, we kind of misconstrue this as if it is a commodity. It's not a commodity. It's not objective. It is subjective. Faith is who we are in our trust. So I think that we really need to look deep into this passage, because Paul is going to refer to faith particularly time and time again. And then we get the first inkling of this dilemma that Paul finds himself in. To the Jew first, and also the Greek. There's the dualism. There it's laid out, and there is the struggle that Paul himself in. And the righteousness of God, which one dimension of that, the righteousness can also be understood as the faithfulness of God, can be trusted. And so the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. Or that word can be also understood as faithfulness. That word that is used for faith, that is left often by faith for faith, but that word can also be used for the faithfulness. So the faithfulness of God for the faithfulness of those who receive or trust is a possible understanding of that phrase. As it is written, and then he goes back to I think it's out of the Psalms, maybe, where this comes, Habakkuk, maybe. The one who is righteous will live by faith. I mean, it's out of his tradition. You know, it comes out of his learning. It comes out of Torah or the prophets. Rather. So anyway, this whole 16 and 17 really becomes the foundation for what Paul is going to be wrestling with through much of the rest of this epistle. Is this whole idea of that our salvation, our finding life in the midst of death comes through our faith in God's presence and God's love in our lives. So then if we go on and take a look at this with regards to some observation, one of the things that is going to also be important all the way through our looking at Paul is looking at the prepositions and how they are translated. For example, there are prepositions that we translate as in, but could be translated by or for, or in a slightly different way that gives us a slightly different understanding. And when we get there, I'll give some examples of that. But one of the things that we will find in Romans, and I haven't thought a lot about this, but probably is in the other letters, is that we will see transitions when Paul or the writer uses gar, which is for, and the other is therefore. Whenever we come to a therefore, we need to pay attention. And it also indicates, you know, when I was saying we need to read big blocks of this, because if we just stick to the, you know, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, we don't get the flow. We don't get the connections. Because the therefore is usually connected up to just what went before. And so it is important for us to take a look at that and to have the flow goes first all the way through the book, and then take a look at boy howdy, I typed a lot of stuff. So anyway, let's proceed, because now we have another issue that also gets, I think, mistranslated or misunderstood. And that's the word wrath, the wrath of God. You know, that gets employed with regards to God wiping us out. You know, it gets utilized in terms of angry God, and there, you know, there is some of that there, but it's not an angry God that destroys us. It's an angry God that punishes to bring back into relationship. All the way through relationship that God has with the Israelites, regardless of how angry God gets, regardless how many times we use the term wrath, God still loves. So again, we've got to hold that intention and understand that intention. It is not a cutting off. It is not an intentionally destroying.
It's not a termination of the relationship.
There we go. It's not a termination. Whatever the implications of the anger of God, it is, I look at it, the anger that I felt when I saw my on the street. You know, I would have really liked to have just not been angry in that moment, but I was when I scooped him up and, what are you doing? You know, I think that we can see at least a dimension of the wrath in that kind of understanding. Is I'm sorry, I oh yes, it was an act, absolutely. It was an act of caring, and I think that's exactly what the wrath that we see here, where we often want to understand it as revenge, because we want revenge. I mean, quite frankly, right now, our president, I'd like to have some revenge. I mean, anybody that treats a leader of another, anyway, I can really get into wrath there, I'll tell you. Now we're going to have some wrath. But it's not revenge, it's love.
What it was Dennis Greener when it said it's not the termination of a relationship.
No, Mark said that. Mark said.
In fact, I was thinking it's not the termination, it's because I want to enhance the relationship that I'm doing this. I want the relationship to be better.
Yes, yes. And it is and if we finish that particular sentence, particularly, we see the purpose of the wrath. The wrath is because of the godliness and the wickedness and those who suppress the truth, but it is for what God is showing us. How to be, how to live, how to do. And because then it goes on with regards to ever since the creation of the world, the entire power, the whole divine nature is for life, is for creation, is for emergence, it's for possibility. And so Paul is, you know, if we read the whole thing, we get a better sense that this wrath is not termination, it is not revenge. It may be a motivation that many of us do not fully embrace, but that's part of it. But we can't even leave it there, because when we get over in chapter 2, we're going to see a tension there, because there Paul says, do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? So if we leave ourselves in chapter 1, verse 18, with this negative termination, revengeful understanding of wrath, we've missed it. We can't have that without it being in dialogue and finding the messy stuff in between with regards to, on the other side, it is God's kindness that is to motivate us. And so we know that we can't leave it stand by itself. And we can't leave it stand as how it has been interpreted, particularly for the last 150 years. So that's the reason I think it's important for us to take a look at Romans, because Romans is an important letter in struggling with these relationships and helping maybe us to understand ourselves a little better as Christians. This wrath is not ours to employ: termination, revenge, all those kinds of things. Okay? Does that make sense? So then we go through this next list of things that are evident about God's presence, and they aren't seen, aren't recognized, are blinded to them. And we see, to some degree, he's talking here about the pagan rituals, exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal human behavior, birds, four-footed animals, so on and so forth. That what we know about God's presence gets substituted because we can't understand it or don't want to understand it. Then we come to our first therefore. We have this listing of behaviors, and then therefore God gave them up in lusts of their hearts to impurity. And as we read through the rest of it, we already jump to homosexual love. Has nothing, in my estimation, now there are, scholars will argue with it. In my estimation, it has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with is in temple prostitution, I think. That we are seeing here again a parallel to what we have just seen with regards to exchanging the glory of the immortal God for worship here, and then this therefore giving them up. I don't think we've jumped to an entirely different subject. I think we're still flowing through with regards to worshiping that which is not of God, of Paul's understanding of God. So, you know, as may have given up for the worship of the animals, and you know, it's not right, but and here again, okay, if that's, you know, there comes a time you just can't change people's behavior. So you just give it up and let them experience their own wrath. Okay. And the conclusion, I mean, the verse 28 again, I think ties it together, because they did not see fit to acknowledge God, did not see fit to worship God, did not see fit to bring God into their midst. And so they got involved with lusts and with all of these other kinds of things that go on in the temple, in some temples, that Paul is persuaded to argue against, because he does not see in that fulfillment or the expression of love. And then we go on. I mean, we see there at the end of 29 this whole list of things that we do to violate others. And so I think, again, there is this continuation all the way through, giving them up to their lusts, giving them up to unnatural intercourse, unnatural ways of treating one another, because it goes right on that they are filled with wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit. I mean, I don't know if there's enough words to finish up. Craftiness. They're gossips. Uh-oh. Well, I just lost the group there. And I'm with you. I'm out the door. Gossips, slanderers, God haters, insolent, haughty. I can be a little haughty once in a while. I know you don't imagine that. But, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents. If you weren't rebellious towards your parent, would you please raise your hand? No. In fact, the other story, I would tell parents who came in to see me in the office, and they would talk about the rebellion of the kids. That's their job. That's their job to be rebellious. The only way they're going to find themselves apart from you is to rebel. So let's figure out how we can help that growth take place. Foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. You know, Paul has a bigger vocabulary than we could possibly imagine. They know God's decree. Those who practice such things deserve to die. Okay, is that physical? Is that emotional? Is that spiritual? You know, it's not determined specifically. So, you know, Paul has also got caught up in this now. They deserve to die. But to some degree, I think he's already indicated they have died to the possibilities of life and relationship and love.
So when you look at his life prior to his conversion, his experience, and sometimes wonder if he's not thinking about what he was.
I think you are absolutely right, because
To say he was dead, he was like he was dead. That's his other life.
you know, I really hate to confess this, but I think most sermons that I preached were really to me. I think I was probably projecting into the sermon and in the congregation what I needed to hear. I can say this now because I'm not preaching, so.
Because we're always growing. You know, I'm not as smart as I hope to be someday, but I'm not as dumb as I used to be.
You are absolutely right. I'm not certain that everybody embraces that, Connie. I don't know that everybody embraces that understanding. Well, I mean, and for those who embrace that understanding, that's the only way, you're right, that's the only way you can live. And I think that's kind of reflective of what Paul's saying here. That's the only way you experience life, is to embrace that. If you don't embrace that, you're dead.
Well, and I laugh at some of it, you know, I don't damn it, because it taught me something. So it's not damnable, it's a process.
It's a process. And that's another one of those things that we need to be more emphatic about teaching. You know, it's not this either or, good, bad, black, white, going to hell, going to heaven. You know, I mean, that's it's this process of emerging and embracing and allowing life to emerge. Anyway, okay, then there's another therefore. You have no excuse. And what Paul is doing here, he is including both Jews and Gentiles. He is not including one or the other or excluding. I think it's highly important that we see that all the way through Paul, he sees this as together. Denny,
That's emphatically, talked about in the text, but most English translations don't translate an important word that is in chapter 2, verse 1. Literally, it says, therefore you, O human,
yes,
have no excuse, whoever you are.
and that's left.
And, you know, you started out earlier talking about, dualism, Jew Greek kind of thing. One of the other. Paul, I think throughout Romans is busy, eliminating those distinctions. But the argument that he's got leading up to this point, he takes what had been a Jewish stereotype of Gentile culture,
Mhm.
and Jewish stereotypes kind of equated Gentiles with deviant sexual acts.
Mhm.
And in the sequence of his argument, he talks about, okay, or he uses words within Jewish circles would deal with deviant sexual activity, and then and he says, okay, that's because of a prior problem of idolatry, putting your trust, putting your faith somewhere other than where it belongs.
Right.
But then he moves to that long list of things that you had mentioned, which include things that everybody ends up dealing with.
Everybody.
And so it's no longer one group pointing their fingers at another, but starting to be able to talk about what you yourselves, regardless of your cultural background, your religious background, these are things that are common, and then therefore you, O human, have no excuse, whoever you are. That's where I am. And for Paul, he's basically uniting his audience. However, they've thought of themselves before. He's really brought them to a point of.
That's exactly where we're headed with this, because in chapter 2, that is precisely where Paul is headed, is reflecting back on what we have just been through. And unfortunately, Denny is absolutely right. If you take a look at old human, which is this unification, this way of not separating out one or the other, is missing in most translations. And then we get to this whole concept of how we exclude, and it's judgment. And it is this way of being able to say, you're wrong, I'm right. And Paul points out that none of us are right, because in some way, the very thing that we judge others to be doing, we are doing ourselves. And he is moving into this way of virtually say later is we are all collectively guilty of sin, which means we are all part of the brokenness in terms of a healthy, a right relationship with God. It doesn't have to do with chewing gum, but underneath your seat in the movie theater. It has to do with this very serious sense of separation, of alienation that is brought about. But he is moving on with regards to this continually way of illusion by talking about judgment. And in judging, we unify ourselves because we condemn ourselves. We may not think of it that way, but the moment we judge, we have become together. Because we're doing the very things, or the others is doing the very same thing back at us. We are judging one another, which means we are condemning ourselves in the midst of that, which means we're together. And then we get to this this piece about, do you despise the richness? Now here Paul opens this whole thing up with regards to the richness of God's grace, the richness of God's love. Is, do you despise the richness of kindness? And sometimes we do despise the fact that God can be kind to somebody else. Do you despise the kindness and the forbearance and patience? Those are three adjectives that is being used on behalf of God. And do you not realize, this is where this powerful, powerful counterbalance to some of the other things that we think are primary, but are just a part of this journey that Paul's making. And now we see the counterbalance to that is God's kindness. It is the kindness that is to lead us to repentance. And we have another discussion about wrath. We have an interesting structural way of teaching, I guess, that goes on in verses 6 through 11. We see there, we will A, B, C, C, B, A. With regards to how this unfolds. We begin with that this statement, he will repay according to the deeds. We finish out, God has no partiality. The B is patiently doing good. And one of the things we also see happen a lot in Paul. Paul is really interested in the doing and not the believing. He is, and it's not works righteousness. It's who we are that enhances life. And it is in this doing, it is doing good for glory, honor, and immortality will have eternal life. That's not so far apart from what Jesus taught. We see that in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We see that in the parable of the rich young ruler. We see that in the parable of the farmer. Eternal life comes when we do good for others. When we live out the goodness that, I want to say it differently, when we live out the goodness that's within us. That's when we find life. Then there is this C part that has its parallel, seeking and who obey not the truth but wickedness. Then it follows up, there will be anguish and distress. And then we start to build back Jew first and also the Greek. We might want to see that as a separation, as a unity. Pull it together. He's speaking to a congregation that is composed of Jews and Gentiles. And we have in this congregation, congregations. I'm sorry, I use congregation and I mean congregations because we know that there wasn't just one congregation in Rome, there were many. But in these congregations, the Jews who had been exiled under Claudius have missed about 7 years of the development that's taking place in the Gentile church. And again, that term probably doesn't come into full play yet, but in the Gentile communities, during this time that the Jews are gone, they are evolving. And now, after the death of Claudius and the edict is taken away, they come back and find themselves immersed in a way that they had affirmed, but is different. And those who are different have a difficult time bringing back into the community those who were there for 7 years. That's kind of normal, natural. We do that, and we're not so far from that. So anyway, Paul is desperately trying to unify a community of people who are apart, as Danny has said. The Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no impartiality or no partiality. We can't see words that Paul is using all the way through Rome with regards to not division and separation, of which the irony is that Romans has often been used as the most anti-Semitic gospel you can imagine. It's not. It is this struggle with a relationship and trying to discover how these promises by God get lived out. So this unification, again, God shows no partiality. And then we go back to this idea, all have sinned. Not Jews, it's not Gentiles, it's all. I'm sorry about you, you may have sinned, I have. There is no way that any human being gets through this without being connected to one another in the fact that we sin. We're human. That's not an excuse necessarily, but that's the truth. And then again, we hear Paul saying, it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight. What do you think he's going to say? But the doers of the law who will be justified. Whether it was actually the actual speech of Jesus goes back to Matthew. Whoever wrote Matthew understood this. Again, picks up on some of the teaching in Luke. What is it? How are we separated? Again, of course, the either or, but how are goats and lambs? It is by the behavior of how we treat those who are in prison, those who need to be fed, those who need to have water, that's, it's not a formula belief. Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and do you go to heaven? No. It's do you believe that you're called to minister to others? Yes.
So in my Lutheran church background, they always hated that book of James because it seemed to say you have to do things in order to, it was saying justification by acts. What you're saying, and I think what you see is if somebody goes around and preaches something but doesn't live it, you don't believe that. So what you're doing, I think, reflects what's in your heart. It reflects what your belief is. But if you don't, and I think I read something once that said it's kind of a way to test if your beliefs, if it's real for you. Look at what you're doing. If you're not acting according to what you say you believe, maybe you don't really believe that. So yeah, what you're looking at those, looking at how people behave.
That's right. And you've pointed something up And I think that this also needs to always be taken into consideration. The books of the Bible are not to be isolated. They are a dialogue that's taking place here. Because you can't say everything that needs to be said in one sentence, or one paragraph, or one letter. And so, yes, James doesn't see it differently and he approaches it differently, but it's part of the dialogue.
I grew up hearing, I wish that book wasn't in the Bible.
Well,
I heard that a lot because they were doing what you said. They were looking at it alone and not looking at it in the whole context.
sure. And, you know, it's, I mean, I think James is virtually a corrective. You know, to not doing what we believe. And he's saying, if you don't do what you believe, it's worthless. And Paul's saying that right here. He's already said it. And now we get into something that is highly important with regards, again, going back to some of the teachings of Jesus, but it's highly important. This next section, where again, Paul is pulling people together, not on belief, but on behavior. And what he is saying here is that the Gentiles, and he is now looking at the law as a guide. The law is a guide into how you are to behave. And they're doing instinctively what the law requires. They are treating people with respect, dignity, honor, all of those kinds of love and our words. And Paul probably has 37 more that I can't think of. But if he were doing the list, you know, we would have that. So it's important we take seriously Romans and through here, because he is in fact showing the connection, the very depth of the connection between those who follow the law and those who don't follow the law, but that are doing what the law says. One group is doing it instinctively, not necessarily so, because then he's going to go on and he's going to dip into Jeremiah, where in Jeremiah, give you a new covenant and it will be written on your hearts. And we hear that right here with Paul. So if you call yourselves a Jew and boast of how you are behaving under the law, you're wrong. Or if you call yourself a non-Jew and boast, you're not necessarily right either. Then this leads into, and I know I'm over material, but you know, if we're going to get through Romans, we're going to kind of have to do that. Then we get to an issue that is critical and has been critical in each one of the congregations that Paul has visited or heard about or has written. And it's not just something to take lightly. When a people believe that their fulfillment of the covenant is to fulfill circumcision, that is not something to be taken lightly for them. It is something that is deeply significant and spiritual and faith producing. To do that, what they understand is essential to fulfill the covenant. And again, Paul is dipping back then into what he has said about behavior, and he's going to tie it together pretty soon with regards to the faith of Abraham came before circumcision. So we're going to see that coming up. But here every place he goes, and particularly Romans, where he is hearing some of the tensions that's going on and trying to address that, one of those, and whether he knows specifically or not, he can anticipate that one of the tensions between those in that congregation who are Jews and those who are Christian is the issue of circumcision. And it is not to be taken lightly. It is a highly significant, important understanding of the faith journey of a people. Then we again, he reinforces this over in 28 again with regards, a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, being one is circumcised, but doesn't live out what the heart says. Oh, goodness. So then we get over into chapter 3. Again, an important question. What advantage has the Jew? What is the value of circumcision? Paul understands the nature of what's going on in the lives of those who embrace circumcision, much in every way. For it was through this process that they understood their relationship to God. It becomes, rather than being able to see through the nature of God's commitment, through this act of circumcision, it becomes the act itself that becomes important. But behind all of this is seeing how these events, how these teachings reveal something about the power of God's love and presence in the life of a people. And Paul is adamant here and in other places that the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Again, going back to this thing that I said at the very beginning, when God made a promise to God's people, it has to stand, or God becomes fickle. And if that has to stand, God to be righteous, for God to be God, then we got to struggle with that. And this community has to struggle with that. There is something here that was highly significant and important for everyone to be able to understand and to see how God is revealed in the life of God's people. And again, will their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? The faithlessness of a people does not nullify the faithfulness of God. God's faithfulness, God's love, God's consistent involvement in the life of God's people is not nullified by the faithlessness of God's people. Where are we? Let's finish this part of the section and then well, let's go on. Over in 21, we see a continuation of what Paul is talking about here with regards to the faithfulness, the truthfulness of God. Apart from the law, now he's kind of incorporating and moving and expanding. The righteousness of God has been revealed. It is tested to by the law and the prophets. And through the faithfulness, it says the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ. I think it also can say the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So again, there is this preposition that needs to be examined. Does it mean faith in or the faith of? For all who believe, for there is no distinction. Again, Paul is emphasizing there is no distinction. And why is there no distinction? Because we've all sinned. The unifying factor. Oops. The unifying factor is all sinned. And all, we hear this time and time and time again. All, you, we, it's everyone together have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But because of the faithlessness of people does not take away the faithfulness of God, that they are now justified by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. The next verse, we see, I don't know whether I would say it's exactly an exegetical pattern or even a hermeneutical pattern of Paul developing a speech here, a sermon. But what we do see is Paul interpreting an event. His interpretation of the event of the crucifixion and the resurrection falls within the knowledge he has of sacrifice. Blood sacrifice. Although it's not quite, it's not totally within what I understand the majority of sacrifice to be, but the majority of sacrifice was honoring. Because in the ancient world, the way you honor a relationship is a gift and to share a meal. And the sacrifice, if we really take a look at the sacrifices, most of them, what was actually burned was the entrails. Who wants to eat that unless you're making sausage? And then you don't eat it, you just encase it. But but the meat was barbecued and shared. Even there, we have to kind of search to find this whole idea of a blood sacrifice as appeasing God. And we have to put that in the context of the ancient world. The ancient world had this fear of God and did not know how to overcome that. And so developed this whole system of trying to appease the gods. And that doesn't make any difference how far back you go into Mesopotamian. I mean, you can go back as far. There's still this element. In fact, what we find in most of the the archaeological digs as some evidences, probably, of trying to appease the gods. What Paul, I think, is trying to say here is that if we look at the redemption through Jesus Christ, the redemption through Jesus Christ is behavior. I think Paul misses it. It's not required of Jesus to die or for us to believe in that. What's required is that we believe in the self-giving of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus for the life of others. Do you see the distinction? It is not required physical death, but it is how Jesus lived and died. He gave himself. And in that giving to the oppressive powers, there was life. That's what I think the resurrection is. Regardless of how alone we feel, regardless of how difficult life is, even in the dark night of the soul, God speaks to us of life. Let's stop there, okay? We're going to start next time, and I'm going to be doing bigger blocks. I mean, I think we have, what, 4? We've got through almost 3 chapters. We're going to need to be doing some bigger blocks, and which leaves out some of the details that, like Danny is mentioning. We'll try to pick up those which are highly important. Yeah, I'll stop there.